Hello, my name is Staci Faifer, and today I'll be discussing a very important policy known as the Monroe Doctrine. During James Monroe's presidency, he was concerned about Spain reclaiming sovereignty in the Western Hemisphere and took the advice of John Quincy Adams that the United States should protect its land from Spain alone instead of joining forces with Britain. On December 2, 1823, President James Monroe went to Congress and delivered one of the most important speeches of his life and probably one of the most important speeches in the history of the United States. This speech became known as the Monroe Doctrine. During this time, many Americans believed that there should be enough land for every American citizen, what was known as the Manifest Destiny, and the only way in which the United States was to acquire more land was through expansion. At the time of the presentation of the Monroe Doctrine, many countries in Central and South America were declaring their independence or achieved independence from the European colonizers. Monroe had four basic statements in his Monroe Doctrine speech. First, the United States would not get involved in European affairs. Second, the United States would not interfere with the existing European colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Third, no other nation could form a new colony in the Western Hemisphere. Lastly, if a European nation tried to control or interfere with a nation in the Western Hemisphere, the United States would view it as a hostile act against the nation. The European powers were reluctant to give up their territory in the Americas and were prepared to use force to keep them. This led President Monroe to state that the people of the West are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. This declaration was meant to keep the Europeans out of American affairs, and in return, America would stay out of European affairs. He also described under what conditions of the United States would feel threatened when he stated, "We owe it therefore to condone to the amicable relations existing between the United States and powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety." In the essence, the Monroe Doctrine divided parts of the globe into areas of influence and did not want Europeans to establish new colonies in the Americas, leaving the United States as the only powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere. The United States would take it as an unfriendly act if any European were to control any country in the Americas. The original intent was to keep the powerful Europeans from the Western Hemisphere, but it ended up extending America's desire for self-preservation into a mandate for expansion first in Latin America, then into the Pacific, and eventually around the world. This mandate was called into question during the conflicts in Cuba, Korea, Vietnam, Panama, and Grenada, which were all influenced by the Monroe Doctrine. The idea behind the Monroe Doctrine had major implications for the Western Hemisphere and for the United States' relations with other countries in the area. The Monroe Doctrine essentially put the United States in a position of playing big brother towards the Latin American nations. The new U.S. policy benefited these former Spanish colonies as it allowed them to focus upon building their own societies rather than fighting their old masters. Then, when Theodore Roosevelt became president, he became concerned when European creditors threatened armed intervention in Latin America to collect outstanding debts. He introduced the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted the United States' rights to exercise an international police power to restrain such actions. In 1962, during the Cold War Cuban Missile Crisis, President John F. Kennedy invoked the Monroe Doctrine as a justification for setting up a naval air blockade around Cuba. In a tense standoff that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, this action helped pressure the Soviet Union into dismantling and withdrawing nuclear missiles that had been secretly installed in Cuba and aimed at the U.S. In 1814, Great Britain had acquired British Guiana by treaty with the Netherlands, but the treaty didn't define a western boundary. When a border dispute began between Venezuela and Great Britain tried claiming more land. Venezuela protested, broke diplomatic relations with Great Britain, and appealed to the United States for assistance, citing the Monroe Doctrine as justification for U.S. involvement. Although it took decades to become a notably identifiable policy, John Quincy Adams did raise a standard of the independent U.S. foreign policy so strongly that future administrations could not ignore it. The principle of the idea of the Monroe Doctrine would continue to be brought into play by many more politicians and U.S. presidents, including Ronald Reagan and Lyndon B. Johnson. The words of the Monroe Doctrine defined the foreign policy of the United States for a long time and began a policy of American isolation and imperialism.